Have you ever woken up one morning and felt as though the entire world had fallen silent? That was me, Ellen Shaw, on the day after my husband passed. Our house seemed to hold its breath. Every sound was different. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the distant honk of a neighbor's car. Everything reminded me that my life had split into two, before and after. His slippers still sat by the bed as if he might come home and slide them on. But I knew deep down that he never would. I wandered from room to room, tracing memories with my fingertips. The kitchen where we laughed over burnt toast, the porch where we watched the evening settle in the chair by the window where he would read the newspaper. And I would pretend not to notice how he always skipped the politics. Suddenly, these were not just places, but echoes of a life I loved and lost. Grief, I learned, is both heavy and invisible, settling over your shoulders until even the smallest tasks feel impossible. At first, everyone seemed to notice my loss. Friends dropped by with casseroles and gentle words. Neighbors offered hugs that were awkward but kind. My church sent cards, and the phone rang with voices promising, "Call if you need anything." But after the funeral, the world went on. The calls slowed, the casseroles stopped, and the silence returned thick and relentless. I tried to keep busy cleaning, reading, watering the garden, but nothing filled the space he left behind. Even the sunlight seemed different. In those quiet weeks, I realized how much of my identity had been woven into caring for him. For months, I was nurse companion, steady hand. I learned the language of hospitals and doctors, of hope and disappointment. I became an expert in small comforts, warm tea, favorite music, the right way to fluff his pillow. When it was over, I didn't just lose my husband, I lost the rhythm of my days, the purpose that pulled me out of bed each morning. I felt unmoored, drifting from one hour to the next. I began to wonder if this was simply the way things ended for women like me, suddenly alone after decades of togetherness. Sometimes late at night, I would open the closet and breathe in his scent, half hoping for a sign or a dream. But what I found more than anything was fear. Fear that I would fade away without anyone noticing. Fear that my story and my value had ended with his. It's a secret kind of heartbreak that so many older women carry in silence. I remember one evening sitting on the porch with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The sun was setting, casting golden light through the empty branches, and I felt a wave of both sadness and gratitude. I had loved and been loved. That's not something everyone gets to say, but now I faced a new question. Who am I now that I am only me? How do you start over when your world has been defined by someone else for so long? I didn't have the answer. Not yet. It was during this time of quiet searching that my daughter called from Ohio. She said she was worried about me living alone, that maybe being closer to family would help. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I could rebuild something new, even if it looked nothing like before. So with a trembling hope and a suitcase full of memories, I agreed to leave the only home I had ever truly known. What I didn't realize, standing at the crossroads of my grief and my future, was that this next chapter would test everything I believed about family love and what it means to belong. When my daughter Julia called to suggest I come live with her family in Ohio, her voice was gentle, but carried an urgency I recognized. She said, "Mom, it would be so good for you to be near the kids. You shouldn't be alone in that big house." I could tell she meant well. The loneliness had started to eat at me, and part of me clung to the idea that a change of scenery could chase away the shadows. Still, the thought of leaving my home, the rooms where every photo, every chipped mug, every squeaky step held a memory, filled me with dread. I hesitated, but Julia's insistence was loving and persistent. I told myself sometimes the only way forward is to say yes to the unknown. Packing up my life was harder than I expected. I moved slowly, sorting through drawers of photographs, drawers that held decades' wedding pictures, baby socks, handwritten letters from my late husband, birthday cards, from years when the kids were small, and the house rang with laughter. Every box was a small farewell. I donated furniture, held a yard sale, and tried to keep the tears at bay as neighbors I'd known for 30 years hugged me goodbye. I realized I wasn't just leaving a house, I was closing the chapter on everything familiar. It was in a way a second loss, and I wondered if I was running away from loneliness or just running toward something new desperate for meaning. There's a common story in America, one you see in movies and magazines, where families welcome their elders home in times of need, 3 generations under one roof, helping each other, making memories. But the truth is rarely that simple. My friend Alice, who moved in with her son after her husband died, whispered to me once, "It's not always like the Hallmark movies, Ellen. Sometimes you feel more invisible than ever." Still, I wanted to hope. I wanted to believe that my story could be different. That being needed by my daughter, my grandchildren, might help me stitch my heart back together. As I loaded the last of my boxes into Julia's minivan, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. Tired eyes, gray hair, a face that felt both familiar and strange. I wondered if I'd made a mistake, or if this leap would be the thing that saved me from disappearing. Sometimes we take these leaps not because we're certain, but because the alternative, standing still, is too hard to bear. In those days, the pain of staying felt heavier than the risk of leaving, and so I chose movement over stagnation, hope over fear. Moving day itself was a blur, a 7-hour drive through rolling fields, past towns I'd only ever seen on road signs. The kids were mostly quiet in the back seat, plugged into their headphones, while Julia chatted about school schedules and the neighborhood pool. I tried to picture myself there, helping with homework, baking cookies, finding purpose in the rhythms of a new family. It sounded simple when Julia described it, but I knew deep down that real life is always messier, more complicated. Still, I allowed myself a flicker of excitement. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something good. The lesson I learned during that long drive is one I wish I'd known sooner. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of what you know and step into a world that feels strange. It's tempting to cling to old routines, to familiar faces, and well-worn habits. But real healing, often asks us to move, to risk the unfamiliar, to believe that our story isn't finished yet. By the time we pulled into Julia's driveway, I was tired but hopeful, my heart beating just a little faster as I glimpsed her home, my new beginning. I didn't know then that my idea of family would be challenged in ways I'd never expected, or that the journey ahead would be far from simple. But as I stepped out of the car and into my daughter's world, I promised myself to stay open to the pain, to the joy, and to all the ways love can both heal and wound us. Little did I know the true test of belonging was just about to begin. The first moments inside Julia's home felt a little like walking onto a stage, after all the actors had already taken their places. The house was bright and airy walls, lined with cheerful family photos and children's artwork. There were shoes piled near the door and the faint smell of cinnamon in the air, but the warmth didn't quite reach me. Julia greeted me with a quick hug, already distracted by a buzzing phone, while her husband Mark offered a polite nod before heading back to his office upstairs. The grandchildren, Evan and Chloe, barely looked up from their tablets to murmur a hello before melting into the couch, lost in their own digital worlds. I tried not to take it personally. Children today, I reminded myself, were different than in my day, quieter, often hidden behind screens, their worlds filled with games and group chats I didn't understand. Still, the silence stung. When I was a child, grandparents were always surrounded by noise, laughter, arguments, the clatter of a big Sunday dinner. My own parents used to say, family is meant to live together, to care for each other. But here, I felt like a guest in someone else's story, tiptoeing around the edges of a life that didn't seem to have a space reserved for me. My room was a small, tidy guest room at the end of the hall. Julia had made the bed with fresh linens and left a vase of flowers by the window. It was a thoughtful gesture, but the space still felt temporary, like a hotel I might check out of any day. I placed my suitcase quietly in the corner and looked out at the backyard, hoping for some sense of belonging to settle in. But even as I unpacked, I realized I wasn't sure which closet was mine, which shelf to use in the bathroom, whether I was welcome to join Mark for coffee in the morning or if that was his private ritual. These were the unspoken boundaries, the invisible fences that spring up in families sometimes without anyone realizing it. That first evening, we sat down to dinner together. Mark talked about work. Julia asked the kids about school. The kids barely answered. I tried to add a story from my day, but the conversation moved on quickly, as if I were speaking through glass. It was a small thing, but it left me feeling invisible. I remembered my friend Linda, whose daughter had set strict quiet hours in her home. No talking after 9 p.m., no television in the living room. It's just the way things are now, Linda had told me. You have to learn to blend in or stay out of the way. At the time, I thought she was exaggerating, but now I understood. In the days that followed, these unspoken rules became clearer. I found myself waiting for Julia to finish in the kitchen before making tea. I asked if I could do laundry, even though the machine was sitting idle. Once I tried to help unload groceries, and Julia gently said, "Oh, I've got it, Mom. Why don't you rest?" It was meant to be kind, but it left me unsure what my role was supposed to be. Was I a helper, a guest, or just a reminder of a time gone by? I missed the feeling of being needed, the familiar rhythm of my old home where I knew every creaky board and where I fit in every conversation. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people, but feeling like you're standing on the outside, looking in. It's a quiet ache, the kind you carry with you as you try to adapt to new rhythms and rules. In America today, so many older adults experience this when moving in with family. Everyone means well. But life moves fast, and it's easy to become invisible in your own story. I learned that you can't force belonging. It has to be offered slowly with patience and genuine care. The small lesson I took from those early days was simple but powerful. When you open your home to someone, don't forget to open your heart and your routines as well. True welcome is more than clean sheets or fresh flowers. It's an invitation to share in the real messy, noisy life of a family. I hoped things would change, that time would soften the boundaries and let me in. But deep down, I knew the real test of family was only beginning. I was about to learn that even invisible lines can leave the deepest marks. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice just how many small ways a person can feel, both present and invisible. Every day seemed to bring a new gentle reminder that I was here on borrowed time. It started with routines. Julia preferred to pack lunches the night before, and she'd gently ask me not to fuss in the kitchen after dinner. Mark liked his coffee brewed a certain way, and one morning when I made a fresh pot, he quietly poured it out and started again. No one raised their voice, and no one meant to hurt me, but these tiny moments added up, little chinks in the armor of my dignity. Sometimes the boundaries were so subtle, I didn't notice them until I'd crossed a line. One afternoon, I decided to fold the family's laundry while they were out, thinking I'd be helpful. When Julia came home, she thanked me, but then quietly refolded every towel and rearranged the drawers. I felt awkward, unsure if I'd overstepped. In my old home, folding towels was an act of care. Here, it felt like trespassing. I tried to remind myself that everyone has their way, but with each small correction, my confidence shrank a little more. Real-life friends warned me about this before I moved in. My neighbor from back home, Mrs. Franklin, once spent 6 months living with her daughter in Chicago. She told me, "Ellen, you love your family, but don't expect their home to become yours. It never really does." She missed her garden, her friends, the little freedoms that made her feel like herself. She moved back even though she was lonely, because, as she put it, "I'd rather be alone in my own house than invisible in someone else's." I didn't understand her then. Now each day I felt her words settle in my chest. Dinner times became the clearest example of my new role. Julia often served the kids first, then Mark, and then almost as an afterthought. She'd ask, "Mom, do you want some?" I knew she wasn't trying to be unkind, she was just busy balancing work-school schedules and the constant hum of daily life. But I couldn't help feeling like an extra place, sitting never quite sure if I should join in or wait for an invitation. Even Chloe, my granddaughter, once asked Grandma, "Do you live here now, or are you just visiting?" The question was innocent, but it stung more than she could know. I started to withdraw, keeping mostly to my room or sitting quietly in the backyard. I told myself I was giving the family space, but really I was trying not to take up too much of it. There's a strange kind of sadness in feeling unnecessary. I missed the days when someone needed me, when my hands were busy, when my advice was sought, when my laughter filled the kitchen. Here my presence was something to be managed, a shadow, moving softly around the edges. If you look at families across America, especially among immigrant communities, multi-generational living is a source of strength. Grandparents care for grandchildren, share wisdom, and hold the home together. But for many like me, These new boundaries are polite but firm. The routines are set, the spaces carefully divided. The rules unspoken but unbreakable. I realized how dignity can slowly erode, not through big confrontations, but through 100 tiny, well-meant restrictions that leave you feeling less and less like yourself. The lesson I learned, though it took me time, was that everyone, no matter their age, needs to feel useful, respected, and seen. A home is more than walls and windows. It's the freedom to make a cup of coffee your way, to fold towels and laugh when you get it wrong, to speak up at dinner and know someone is listening. I wished for those things, but more than anything, I wished to be needed again. I didn't know then that a single conversation would shatter the fragile peace I'd built. One careless sentence spoken just out of earshot would change everything and set in motion the hardest chapter of my journey. I still remember the evening when everything changed, though the memory comes in fragments, like watching your own life through a rain-streaked window. Julia and Mark were in the kitchen after dinner, their voices just low enough to suggest privacy, just loud enough that I could catch the tone if not the words. I was clearing the table, careful not to interrupt. Chloe and Evan were upstairs, their laughter drifting down like a promise that some things still belonged to Joy. Then I heard it, Julia's voice, tired and thin. "I just wish Mom didn't make things so complicated. I know she means well, but it's exhausting." Mark's reply was a sigh, followed by, "Maybe she just needs something else to do. We can't keep rearranging everything for her." The words landed softly, but they cut deeper than anything I'd faced since losing my husband. Suddenly, I wasn't Ellen the mother or the helper. I was a burden. An inconvenience, something to be managed or worked around. The walls of the kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. I stood perfectly still, not wanting to draw attention, but inside I felt myself shrinking, folding in on all those soft places I'd tried to protect. I wanted to disappear, to spare them and myself the awkwardness of being too much. I thought of my friend Susan, who confided in me after she moved in with her daughter following a hip surgery. "It's like I went from being her mom to being her project," she told me. "They love you, but they resent the disruption." Susan had tried so hard to be helpful, cooking, cleaning, watching her grandkids, yet always felt like she was stepping on toes. Her experience was not unique. Across America, so many parents and grandparents discover that when you cross that invisible line from independent to dependent, love gets tangled with frustration and guilt. In the days that followed, I found myself treading more lightly. I offered to help less. And when I did, I asked first, my voice quieter. I avoided the kitchen when Julia was busy, and I stopped suggesting ways to organize the pantry or help with Chloe's homework. I worried always that my presence would tip the balance from comfortable to complicated. Even the kids seemed to sense the shift, giving me extra space, their hugs shorter, their eyes darting away. I started calling old friends just to hear a voice that remembered me before all this change. The lesson in those hard days was as clear as it was painful. It's easy for people to confuse love with obligation. I realized that Julia and Mark cared about me, but their lives were already stretched thin. The pressure of modern life, careers, kids' bills, the expectation to do it all made even a small change feel like an earthquake. I reminded myself that love is sometimes clumsy, sometimes silent, and that needing help didn't make me weak or unworthy. Still, the loneliness settled deeper, pressing in from every side. If I could give advice to anyone facing this crossroads, it would be to speak up sooner. Families, especially in America, are often afraid to talk about the hard stuff. We want to believe that love is enough to carry us through, but without honest conversations, small misunderstandings can become giant rifts. I wish I'd told Julia how I felt, or asked Mark what would make things easier. Maybe it would have changed something, maybe not. But silence is heavy, and it never solves what's quietly breaking. I didn't know that even harder days were coming. I thought the worst had passed until the day Julia and Mark announced they were taking the kids to Florida for a family vacation, and I realized I would be left behind alone in a house that was never really mine. The morning Julia and Mark told me they'd be taking the kids to Florida for a week, I tried to smile. "We just need some family time, nuclear family, Julia said gently, like she was offering an explanation for something inevitable. "You'll be fine here, right, Mom?" Mark assured me they'd stock the fridge and leave emergency contacts on the counter. Chloe hugged me before piling into the car, and Evan called "Bye, Grandma" as the garage door rattled shut. Then just like that, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I stood in the hallway unsure what to do with so much empty space. At first, I told myself this was a good thing, some solitude, a chance to breathe. I read my favorite mystery novel in the sunroom, made tea just the way I liked it, and took long walks around the block. But soon the silence grew heavy, and the hours seemed to stretch on forever. I opened the refrigerator and realized it wasn't as full as promised: a carton of eggs, some old cheese, a half-empty jug of milk. I didn't have a car, and the nearest store was too far to walk. I rationed what I had, careful not to use up anything the family might need when they got back. I thought of my friend Carol, whose children live 3 states away. There are days, she once said, when I feel like the world would keep spinning, even if I vanished. Carol's children called her sent postcards at Christmas, but rarely visited. For so many older Americans, especially those living with family, the fear of being forgotten isn't just about being alone. It's about being invisible in the lives of people you love most. I felt the sting of that truth in every quiet corner of Julia's house. The days blurred together. I did small chores, watering the plants, folding towels, straightening up rooms that no one used. Each evening, I watched the sunset from the porch, remembering when my husband and I would sit together, talking about everything and nothing. Now I spoke only to myself. I wondered if Julia realized how easily family time could mean not you. I didn't blame her. She was trying to hold her own life together, to make memories with her children before they grew up and moved away. But the ache of exclusion settled deep, a reminder that love doesn't always look like presence. The lesson I learned during that long, empty week was simple but hard. Self-reliance is a kind of armor, and sometimes it's the only thing that keeps your spirit intact. It's tempting to wait for someone else to rescue you, to hope that love will fill every void. But the truth is, there are times when you must learn to rescue yourself. I started writing in my journal again, just a few lines a day, reclaiming a piece of myself I'd let go. I called Carol, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. It felt good to hear my own voice, to remember I was still here. When Julia and Mark returned tanned and tired, I greeted them with hugs and asked about the ocean, the theme parks, the meals they'd shared. I listened, smiling as the kids recounted their adventures. I didn't mention the loneliness or the empty fridge. I realized then that sometimes the best way to love is to let go of what you wish for and make peace with what is. I wouldn't always be included, and that had to be okay. But even as I tried to settle back into my place on the margins, a new thought began to grow. If I couldn't belong here, maybe it was time to build a life somewhere else, one where I could be seen, needed, and whole again. I didn't know how or where to start, but I knew I couldn't wait for someone to choose me. The next chapter would have to begin with me. The first Monday after Julia's family trip, I sat alone in the kitchen, turning my teacup slowly in my hands. The sun streamed through the window, catching on the dust motes that danced in the quiet air. It occurred to me as the silence pressed in that I had been waiting for a sign, for someone to tell me I mattered again. But that sign would not come unless I made it myself. The realization settled over me like a gentle dawn. I could wait forever, or I could choose myself, even if it felt frightening at first. I started small. I made a list of things I once enjoyed, but had let go of over the years. Painting, baking bread, volunteering at the library. Each seemed impossible now, as if the world outside this house had moved on without me. But the memory of creating, of helping, still sparked something in me. I signed up to volunteer at the local food pantry. My hands shook as I walked through the door on that first day. But by the end of my shift, I felt lighter, as if I'd shed a heavy coat I didn't realize I was wearing. One afternoon, I met Maribel, a single mother with 2 young children, at the pantry. She was exhausted, her eyes shadowed by worry. As we packed up her groceries, she confessed, "Sometimes I feel like I'm the only one in the world." I knew that feeling, the loneliness, the fear. I found myself offering her advice, sharing recipes for quick, healthy meals, and simply listening. We laughed about burnt toast and the endless parade of laundry. That day, I saw my own resilience reflected in someone else's struggle, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. I felt needed. This small act of reaching out rippled through my days. I baked loaves of bread for the pantry's Saturday breakfast and brought cookies for the staff. I started painting again, leaving little watercolor cards in the pantry's donation bags, hoping they might bring a smile to someone's face. Each gesture was a way of claiming a bit of my old self, even in this new, uncertain chapter. I realized that being useful, offering kindness without expecting anything in return, restored a sense of dignity that had quietly slipped away. There's a myth that only the young can reinvent themselves, that after a certain age the best you can hope for is comfort and routine. But the truth I discovered is that rebirth is possible at any stage, if you're willing to risk a little hope. My friend Greta, who learned to play the piano at 70, often says, "The hardest part is starting. The second hardest part is forgiving yourself for waiting so long." Her words rang true. I had been waiting for permission to begin again. Now I saw that the only permission I needed was my own. If there's a lesson in this, it's that power doesn't always look like strength or defiance. Sometimes it's as simple as taking one small step toward the life you want, even if your hands tremble. Every act of self-care, every moment of connection is a seed for something new. I was no longer content to be a shadow in my daughter's home. I wanted to stand in the sunlight again on my own terms. Still, I knew the choice to move forward would not be easy. There were risks, hurt feelings, misunderstandings, the daunting prospect of living alone. But I also sensed that staying would cost me something precious, the right to shape my own story. With a growing sense of resolve, I began to consider what leaving might look like, not as an escape, but as a declaration that I was still here, still capable, still worthy of being seen. I didn't know then how difficult the next steps would be, or how deeply family ties could tangle love with loss. But as I closed my journal that evening and watched the sky darken, I felt a flicker of peace, and for the first time in a long time, a quiet excitement for what might come next. When I finally told Julia and Mark I'd be moving out, the conversation didn't go as I'd hoped. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands folded carefully in my lap, and shared my plans to rent a small apartment nearby, close enough for visits, but with a space of my own. Julia's face fell, a mixture of hurt and disbelief flickering in her eyes. "But Mom, why don't you feel safe here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark stood stiffly by the counter, silent but tense. I tried to explain that I needed to feel useful and independent again, that I missed the feeling of making my own choices. But what I meant as hope, they heard as rejection. After that talk, the atmosphere in the house grew colder. Julia became distant, distracted during our brief conversations, often retreating to her room or busying herself with chores. Mark barely spoke to me at all. The kids were the only ones who seemed unfazed, still running to me for snacks or hugs. But the undercurrent of disappointment and resentment ran deep. One morning, I found that some of my belongings had been moved from the hallway closet, small silent reminders that my presence was already fading from the daily routine. It was a painful echo of what I'd felt for months now, brought to the surface. It wasn't just emotional distance that followed. Soon after I signed the lease on my new place, I began receiving strange phone calls, numbers I didn't recognize, people asking odd questions about my finances and living situation. At first I shrugged them off as telemarketers, but a friend at the food pantry warned me. Sometimes families get scared when they feel like they're losing control. Be careful, Ellen. Not everyone handles change with kindness. I thought of stories I'd read of older adults who faced legal battles over their independence, who had to prove they were capable simply to keep their own lives. I hadn't expected such mistrust from my own children. The tension escalated when I received a letter in the mail from Julia's lawyer, questioning my ability to make decisions and hinting at concerns for my well-being. My heart pounded as I read and reread the document, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or scream. The reality was both humiliating and infuriating. Here I was rebuilding my life, offering help to those who needed it, and yet my own family saw only frailty, danger, or perhaps a threat to their sense of order. I realized how easily love can become tangled with fear, and how quickly a desire to protect can slip into a need to control. My friend Maribel, the single mother I'd met at the pantry, listened to my story with quiet understanding. When my own family found out I was moving out with the kids, they said I was selfish, that I didn't care about anyone but myself. Sometimes Ellen people say family when they mean control. You have to decide what kind of family you want. Her words gave me courage. I sought out a lawyer of my own, documenting everything, making sure my affairs were in order. It was a burden I hadn't expected, but one I bore with quiet determination. I would not let fear or threats define my story. The lesson was clear boundaries once established must be defended. Independence comes with a price, especially for women my age. But so does surrendering your voice, your autonomy, your dignity. I was determined to protect what I'd fought so hard to regain, even if it meant disappointing those I loved. Some bridges I learned can be mended, but others must be crossed for good. Still, as I moved the last box into my new apartment, a mix of relief and sorrow swept over me. I wondered if Julia would ever understand, or if Mark's silence would ever break. But I also felt a spark of hope. In this new place with my own keys and my own rules, I was free to write the next part of my story, whatever storms might come. And I sensed deep down that true belonging could still be found, but it would start this time with me. My first weeks in the new apartment felt like a mixture of freedom and uncertainty. The silence was different here, not the cold hush of being ignored, but the soft promise of space to grow. I arranged my belongings with care, placing familiar photos and hand-painted mugs on the windowsill. For the first time in years, I made breakfast the way I liked, humming as the kettle sang. Yet even as I settled in, I knew the struggle with Julia and Mark wasn't over. The letter from their lawyer still sat on my desk, a constant reminder that independence for someone my age can come at a cost. I met with my own attorney, a kind woman named Ms. Garrett, who listened to my story without judgment. She explained that it's not uncommon for older adults in America to face questions about their decision-making capacity, especially when family members are afraid, hurt, or unwilling to let go. Miss Garrett helped me gather documents and statements from friends, neighbors, even Maribel at the pantry. "You're doing everything right, Ellen," she told me gently. "The law is on your side, but so is your spirit. Don't let anyone take that away." Her words steadied me when the doubt crept in. The process was draining. There were meetings, phone calls, even a brief visit from a court-appointed social worker who asked me about my routines, my finances, my relationships. I answered honestly, determined to show not just my competence, but my joy in living again. Still, it hurt to have to prove myself, to be measured by checklists and interviews instead of trust. I remembered a story from the pantry, a woman named Grace, whose children tried to have her declared unfit after she started dating again in her 70s. "They loved me," Grace said, "but they couldn't see me as anything other than their mother. It was a lonely kind of love, and I understood it better now." Through it all, I leaned on the community I'd found. Maribel would bring her children by for Saturday breakfast, filling my little kitchen with laughter. My friend Greta invited me to her senior choir, and the group welcomed me with open arms, never asking about the details of my family life. Slowly, I realized that healing isn't just about resolving conflict, but about opening yourself to new connections. Each act of kindness, a neighbor waving hello, a child's thank you for a homemade cookie, became a stitch in the fabric of my new life. The legal case eventually closed in my favor. The court recognized my autonomy and dismissed Julia's concerns as unfounded, though the ruling came with a bittersweet ache. There was no dramatic apology from my daughter, no instant return to the warmth we once shared. Instead, there was distance and silence and the hope that time would eventually soften old wounds. I mourned the loss, but I also felt proud. I had stood my ground with dignity, and in doing so rediscovered my strength. If there is a lesson I would offer, it is this: healing after family hurt is neither quick nor easy. It requires courage to seek support, patience to let go of resentment, and the humility to accept that sometimes love cannot be repaired on our timeline. What matters is choosing not to give up on yourself, even when others do. By caring for my own needs, legal, emotional, and practical, I learned that it is never too late to rebuild a sense of belonging. As autumn settled over the city and leaves began to gather on my windowsill, I realized I was ready to look ahead, not just back. I had protected my dignity and rebuilt a small, meaningful life. The final lesson awaited me, a lesson about family, about peace, and about finding home in places I never expected. Autumn passed, and with it the sharp edges of my pain began to soften. The little apartment, once just a refuge, slowly became a home. Each morning I opened the windows to let in the cool breeze, watched sunlight dance across the table, and felt a quiet pride in the life I had built. There was no grand transformation, just small, steady changes, the plants thriving on my balcony, the laughter of Maribel's children, the gentle comfort of knowing I could make my own choices again. Looking back, I see how each step on this journey was both a letting go and a new beginning. Losing my husband taught me how deeply love can shape a life. Moving in with Julia's family reminded me of the ways even the best intentions can go astray. I learned that dignity is fragile, easily eroded by silence and misunderstanding, but also that it can be rebuilt one act of courage, one new connection at a time. My story became proof that we are never too old or too lost to start again. Family, I've learned, is not just about blood or history. It's about respect, kindness, and the space we give each other to be fully ourselves. My neighbors, my friends at the pantry, even Maribel and her children. They became the patchwork of belonging that made me feel seen and valued. There were days when I missed Julia and the family we used to be. But now I understand that true peace comes from accepting what we cannot change and reaching out with hope to what we can. If you're watching this and you recognize even a little of your own story in mine, I want you to know you are not alone. Whether you're a daughter, a mother, a friend, or simply someone searching for belonging, there is always a way forward. Speak up for yourself, even if your voice trembles. Seek out new connections, no matter your age. Don't let anyone, not even those you love, define your worth or limit your dreams. Healing begins the moment you believe you deserve more. As I close this chapter, I carry all the lessons I've learned about courage, forgiveness, and the power of choosing yourself. I hope you carry them too. If this story has touched you, please let me know. Share your own experiences in the comments. I read everyone, and your words might help someone else feel a little less alone. And if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our growing community. Together we can build a place where everyone at every age is welcomed home.